ما فيناش حورين يا كيكة، ما فيناش لف ودوران، ما بقاش فيه وقت يا روحي للشكوى والهجران.
Okay.
From your perspective, and then I also want to hear maybe what you heard from Stephen Mailer and Joseph? Yusuf.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start with your perspective. What do you think were the most similar things between Egypt and Peru / Bolivia, and the least similar things, or say that the most different things and the most similar or same things that you found?
Okay, well basically, what we obviously saw, and they noticed that as soon as we went to the first site, that they saw examples of lost ancient high technology. And so that, the main similarity is that there were highly sophisticated people in both parts of the world. They weren't necessarily the same because the technology used was different. In the case of Egypt, we see saw cuts, we see drill holes, we see technology that we understand. But in the case of Peru, we see, such as the giant wall at Sacsayhuaman, where in some cases 125-ton stones fit together perfectly. And that looks almost like these people were molding the stones, almost like marshmallows. It's beyond our capability to do. So those are the main differences. Egypt, we have technology we understand, but it's more sophisticated to some degree than what we have. And in Peru, it's technology that we can't understand at all.
Okay, and how about from Yusuf Aoyan's perspective? Were there things when you brought him to Peru where he was right away, he said, wow, this looks just like something I've seen in Egypt?
Yeah, basically the polygonal stonework, where you have super tight fitting stonework, is very similar to, for example, in the Valley Temple and the Sphinx Temple. The difference is, in Egypt, you tend to have six-sided cubes, some as large as an automobile. But in Peru, they can be 5-sided, 10-sided, 20, 15-sided. Each stone being a different shape and size, interlocking. So he'd never been out of Egypt before, so he had never seen this stuff except in pictures. He was completely blown away, and so I'll discuss it more with him in March when I'm back in Egypt.
Right. How about Stephen Mailer?
Same thing. Stephen says that he definitely saw evidence of what is believed to be the ancient cataclysm of 12,000 years ago, and he kept repeating that over and over. He saw the obvious differences between what the Inca were capable of doing and what they were not capable of doing, which is similar to what we see in Egypt, to see what the dynastic Egyptians could have done and what they couldn't have done. The Egyptians never were able to work in granite or basalt because the stone is too hard. So a lot of their work, their fine work is in limestone. But limestone is a very soft material.
Okay, and since I really haven't talked to you since your trip to Egypt, I have seen a lot of your videos about your trip to Egypt. What was the most interesting thing about your trip to Egypt?
Basically the Serapeum that I showed you. Also, it's the distances that the stone was moved. The granite in general all comes from Aswan, and we were there, and we saw the quarry, which is the entire city. And then also there are, you'll have to possibly look it up on the internet, but if you look up the colossi of Memnon, which are these two giant seated figures located near Karnak, the stone was brought from the area of Cairo. So that's more than 200 miles away, and that still looks reasonably intact was carved. It was a seated figure of a human, carved out of one block of stone, and finished. That was 720 tons. So there's no way they built a barge and floated it down the Nile. There's no way they dragged it across the ground. So the question is, how did the stone go from the quarry 200 miles to where it presently is?
Okay, I want to let some other people have questions, but I still have lots of questions. Does anyone else have a question? Okay, so when you were in Egypt, did you see lots of things that were obviously damaged by dynamite or bullets, like the different wars that went through, World War II or whatever? Were there sites that had been bombed, or you saw things that had been shot, obviously shot with bullets, or things blown up with TNT or something?
Not so much that. But during dynastic times, these guys were so arrogant that often, a new pharaoh would carve up the names and destroy the works of his predecessor. So it happened then. It happened during the Greek times to some degree. The Romans were completely awful people who destroyed a lot of stuff. And then once the Islamic people had their foothold in Egypt, they destroyed a lot of stuff too, because they regarded it either as being insignificant or, non-Islam, not of their faith. And even up to this day, stuff is being destroyed. Luckily, with the new government in Egypt, which has made the country very stable, the previous president, who was Morsi, who of course was part of the Muslim Brotherhood, they were considering blowing up the pyramids because, they're not Islamic.
Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you when you were showing the tube drill marks, I noticed you found that in Peru and in Egypt, were they similar enough where you could say it was done with basically the same kind of tube drill, the same diameter of tube, the same width of the marks going around the inside? Or they were all different?
No, actually, the drill holes in Egypt are obviously done with a tube drill, because we can see the cross section of where some of them were broken. But the thinness of the wall of the drill is thinner than what we have in modern times, because a modern tube drill has quite a thick head encrusted with diamonds in order to be able to cut through the stone. But these things were, I would say, maybe a millimeter or 2 millimeters in diameter. We don't have that technology. But in Peru, it seems to be more like a sonic drill, or a vibrational drill that didn't turn clockwise or counterclockwise. It simply vibrated and maybe like a random orbital sander works. So it's a completely different form of technology.
So totally different.
Yeah.
And also, when I first started seeing the tube drill marks in Egypt, I always wondered, have you met anyone that's talked about any governments over the last 100 years that have recorded doing their own drilling into those kinds of those blocks, like taking samples to check the stone and stuff like that? I could only imagine 100 years ago a group of archaeologists coming in and saying, okay, we're going to take some samples of this stuff. Do they even do that, or?
Well, the problem is that even now, in the 21st century, whatever those drills were that were functioning removed material 50 times more efficiently than a modern drill.
So the
21st century technology doesn't match
what
was done before.
Right. I guess the whole point is then that, like you said, the technology doesn't match. So it doesn't matter what we had 100 years ago. it can't be better than what they had thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, since our modern technology doesn't match.
No, like if it doesn't exist in 2014, there's no way that it would exist in 1875. I mean, that's what that's why we always try to bring as many engineers as possible with us, because all of them are always in complete shock when they see this stuff. They say, how did they do that? And why did they do that? And, you know, my second trip was last March and April. We had 6 engineers, and they were all completely dumbfounded by this. They couldn't come up with a rational explanation of how some of this stuff was done.
Right. Our modern tube drilling is used to, like, for mining, right? They drill in to put dynamite inside, right? I'm just trying to figure this out. I'm not totally sure.
Yeah, well, it's done for dynamiting. It's also done in order to get a core sample to see the composition of the interior of the stone.
Oh, right.
But these sites are basically half a mile away from any electricity, so you have to have an incredibly long power cord in order to drill a hole. And in general, Egyptologists don't even discuss these are some of the subjects Egyptologists don't discuss because they don't know how to explain them. So they just kind of brush over and go, well, I don't know.
Right. Better for them to not dip their feet in and get wet with the wrong kind of material, or the wrong kind of liquid.
Well, they do.
Go ahead.
No, sorry. They do try to explain it. What they say is that the ancient Egyptians had copper drills, and they used sand and water. And so somebody is sitting there with what's called a bow saw, which looks like a bow from a bow and arrow. And they're holding the tube in one hand, and then they're running this thing back and forth with the other hand, back and forth, like clockwise, counterclockwise. But the evidence shows that these machines were running solely in a clockwise direction and removing material 50 times more efficiently, not 50 times faster, 50 times more efficiently than what a modern drill can do.
This is kind of jumping a little bit, but still in the same area. I remember you posted a video about on the temple, what is it? Is it the Sphinx Temple or it's the Valley Temple? I can't remember. It's got an etched drawing of the flower of life on it. And there were lots of people who believed that it was done with laser or something like that. You were able to get a much closer look at it, right?
Yeah, that's the Osirion.
The Osirion, right.
Yeah, the Osirion is 50 feet underground.
Right.
And it's like a remnant from Star Wars. It's completely bizarre. Rediscovered in the 19th century. They had to dig the whole. They found the roof, and then they kept digging down and they found it. So it's 50 feet below the present surface, where the other temples are. All the other temples are up on the high ground. This thing is underground, and it's called the Osirion because Egyptologists believe it was what's called a ceremonial tomb, which makes no sense whatever. But the flower of life, of which there are, I think, 5, were painted on with red ochre paint.
Right.
They're not significant. Yeah, they're not significant at all. They're just some guy with a paintbrush decided to paint them on underneath so that the sand and rain wouldn't affect them. They've been there probably since the times of the Greeks. But if you look at the stone that they're painted onto, these things weigh 60 to 100 tons and are flat as a glass tabletop.
And the construction of the Osirion is slightly different from the construction of some of the other tables, or sorry, some of the other temples. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a simple design of massive stone. So again, the vertical pillars that used to hold up what would have been the roof weigh between 60 and 100 tons each. And again, that stone is paid for rose granite that came from Aswan. So it was dragged all the way. In that case, I think it's about 200 miles from Aswan. But the important thing is that most of the ancient work that was done before the time of the dynastic Egyptians was done underground. So it's believed that more than probably 80% of what these ancient people did is still buried in the sand. Not that the sand came and covered it. It was done on purpose underground for some bizarre reason.
And that brings me to another question. Did you talk to Yusuf or what? Is his mother, Patricia?
His wife.
His wife, sorry. He'll hate me for saying that it was his mom, or she'll hate me. But did you talk to them about, like, when these things might have been built? Like, is before the old dynasty? Does he have any idea, like, it was before who, or they don't even know, it's just before everyone?
Well, we simply use simply use the term pre-cataclysmic. So that means 12,000 plus years ago. You can't really date it, like, you can't say how long ago. You can say minimum. So minimum 12,000 years ago. Maximum, we don't know.
And I guess the other part of that was, do you have any idea, or did they say anything about how long the Sphinx and the base of the pyramids were covered with sand? Was that they were covered with sand for 1,000 years or 2,000 years?
Actually, thousands of years, because what happened was that originally the Giza Plateau was flat, solid limestone, and the head was sticking out because that's called a yardang. It's a natural feature, which you can see in places like the southwest of the U.S. And so it was a hunk of rock that was higher than the rest of the plateau. And then somebody came along and decided to cut the whole body out. So they cut vertically down into the bedrock to expose the Sphinx. And that's why the Sphinx is in what's called the Sphinx enclosure. So it's most likely that when the dynastic Egyptians arrived, about 5,000 years ago, the Sphinx was buried, most likely, most commonly is buried up to its neck. So it's buried up to its neck. They dug it out, and then over time the sand kept coming back and filling it in. So when Napoleon arrived in the 18th century, he dug it out again. It may have been dug out many times before that. And then the sand came and buried it again. And Yusuf's father, Hakim, when he was a little boy, probably in the 1930s, again it was buried. It was partially buried again. So they're having this constant warfare with the sand, the sands of Egypt wanting to come into the enclosure because it's below ground. The sand naturally wants to keep reburying the Sphinx.
Do you have any opinion on Robert Bouval's idea that the dynastic Egyptians came from further west in Africa, from the water and cattle cults further west?
I don't know about Robert's information anymore. He's a very brilliant guy, but if you look at the faces of the pharaohs, it really varies depending upon what time frame. Because some of them look black and some don't look black. It's more likely that the influence of the black Africans came later. And the ancient Egyptians seem to have been a real racial mix. Part Caucasian, part Semitic, part African, part whatever. Especially if you look at the famous faces of Ramses II, and those sculptures were not done during his time, they're much older. You see what is represented is the perfect human face. So you see characteristics like the almond-shaped eyes, which are, Middle Eastern. And then you have the nose and the mouth. So the Egyptians were a very complex mix of different racial background. What Robert's talking about is dynastic Egyptian times. He doesn't believe in the ancient cataclysm. He doesn't believe that the Big Pyramid is older than 4,500 years, which I find very weird because he is an engineer, and there's no way that he can explain how the dynastic Egyptians could have made that, or the other things I showed you. It's beyond their technical capability.
What do you say to people who argue that the pyramids and everything around there must have been built by slaves?
Well, those slaves would have to each one be a master craftsman, and that's not possible. And it's also been shown that the conventional time frame is that the Great Pyramid was built in 20 to 25 years. And in order to accomplish that, remembering there are 2.3 billion blocks, which are megalithic, each one of those blocks would have to have been cut, moved, and set into place perfectly every 2 minutes. We can't do that, and it doesn't matter how many thousand slaves you have trying to drag these things around, it technically couldn't have been done that way. It had to have been done more likely with some kind of anti-gravity, and by a civilization which is beyond us. We are not the pinnacle of humanity, even though we'd like to think so, because we have cell phones. Other beings or people existed on this planet that were superior in intelligence and technological capability than us. And I think it would be good of us to learn a little bit of humility about who we are and where we are and the greatness of our history and ancestry as a global civilization.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful place.
في الحب ملكش أمان، وأنا عايزة حب حنين، مش حب يودي لمان. أنا عمري لا أحب الخاين ولا أحب الكدابين. ما تروحش تبيع المية في حارة سقاي. عالمين 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 يا سيدي العارفين. عالمين 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 بتبيع الحب لمين؟ إن كنت جاي تغني روح اسأل قبل أنا مين. ما تروحش تبيع المية في حارة سقاي. ملك في الحب ضحايا يحكوا عنك حكايات، بيقولوا انك بتألف في الليلة 7 غنوات، والغنوة الواحدة في ليلة تلحنها 7 مرات، وتروح تاني يوم وتقولها بدموع وحنين وقهار. إن كنت جاي تغني روح اسأل قبل أنا مين. ما تروحش تبيع المية في حارة سقاي.
عالمين 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 يا سيدي العارفين.
عالمين 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 بتبيع الحب لمين؟ إن كنت جاي تغني روح اسأل قبل أنا مين. ما تروحش تبيع المية في حارة السقاي. ما فيناش حورين يا كيكة، ما فيناش لف ودوران، ما بقاش فيه وقت يا روحي للشكوى والهجران. لك ماضي كله سوابق، في الحب ملكش أمان، وأنا عايزة حب حنين مش حب يودي لمان. عمري لا احب الخاين ولا احب الكدابين. ما تروحش تبيع المية في حارة السقايين.
على مين على مين على مين
على مين
على مين يا سيد العارفين
على مين
على مين على مين على مين
على مين
بتبيع الحب لمين
إن كنت جاي تغني روح اسأل قبل أنا مين. ما تروحش تبيع المية في حارة السقايين.